The sound of keys was the only thing left, fighting the silence. Just before sunrise, in a forgotten corner of a city that no longer remembered the names carved into its own monuments, an old man opened the door to a place the world had already passed by. Master Sergeant Arthur Corrigan, U.S. Army retired, 78 years old, spine like a flagpole, walked into the dimly lit hall of VFW Post 789, the same way he had every morning for the last 20 years. He didn't rush. Soldiers never rush. The room greeted him with a scent made of time itself: old varnish, coffee grounds, metal polish, and memory. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through war-warped windows. On the walls, faded photographs watched silently. Young faces locked in a past only the men who survived could understand. Art moved through it all like a priest through a cathedral. This was no clubhouse. It was a sanctuary, a last outpost. He didn't know it yet, but before the week was out, this quiet ritual, this sacred routine, would become the first line in a new kind of war. One not fought with bullets, but with paper, power, and pride. In a quiet corner of a city that was rapidly forgetting its own past, Post 789 stood like a stubborn old oak tree. Its brick facade was weathered, its sign painted in letters that had begun to fade. But to the men who called it home, it was a fortress of solace. The commander of this fortress was Master Sergeant Arthur Corrigan, U.S. Army retired. Art, as he was known, was a man carved from the same granite as the Vietnam War Memorial. He was in his late 70s, with eyes that had seen the jungles of Southeast Asia and the slow, steady march of 7 decades. His leadership wasn't loud. It was a quiet, unshakable presence, a gravitational pull of pure integrity. His days had a rhythm. He'd arrive just after dawn, the jingle of keys the only sound in the cool morning air. He'd brew the first pot of coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in, just the way they liked it. The aroma would mix with the permanent, layered scents of the post: old wood, stale beer, brasso polish, and something less tangible: the scent of history itself. The main hall was a living museum. On one wall, a collection of black and white photos, young men with flat-top haircuts squinting in the Korean sun. On another, the faces of Art's own generation, impossibly young in their jungle fatigues, their eyes holding a story no one else could read. There were plaques, medals, and a glass case holding a carefully folded flag, the flag that had draped the coffin of the post's first commander. To an outsider, it was clutter. To Art, every single object was a testament, a promise. His lieutenants, his brothers, would trickle in. First, usually, was Sully O'Connell, a former Marine Force recon bulldog from Da Nang. Sully was all fire and vinegar, his opinions loud, his loyalty absolute. He saw the world in black and white, right, wrong, and things that needed a fist to the jaw. Then came Deacon Jones, a Korean War combat medic. Deacon was the post's soul, a quiet, thoughtful African-American man who spoke with the gentle wisdom of a country preacher. He was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, the one who would sit for hours with a brother who was wrestling with ghosts. Finally, there was Junior Miller, the baby of the group at 65, a Gulf War vet who understood this new world of smartphones and the internet in a way the others never could. They didn't talk about the horrors. They didn't need to. They talked about bad knees and grandkid photos. They argued about politics and the designated hitter rule. They ribbed each other mercilessly. But underneath it all, they were holding a line for each other. This building wasn't a clubhouse. It was a decompression chamber for souls that had been pressurized by war. It was the only place they didn't have to explain themselves. It was the only place they were truly home. Art's late wife, Helen, had run the ladies' auxiliary bake sales in this very hall. He could still see her smiling by the dessert table, her presence a warm glow that had never truly faded. This was their peace, a peace earned in the mud, the snow, and the sweltering heat of foreign lands. A peace they thought was permanent, but progress, as it's often called, is a hungry beast. One Tuesday morning, an official-looking envelope arrived. It wasn't a donation check or a utility bill. It bore the city's official seal. Art slid it open with the antique letter opener from his desk, a bayonet from the Great War. As he read the words, the familiar comfort of the post seemed to chill. His shoulders, which had borne the weight of a rucksack and the lives of his men, seemed to slump. The letter was filled with cold, legal jargon. Urban redevelopment, public good, eminent domain. The city council, in its infinite wisdom, had found a loophole. They had declared the land underutilized and were seizing it. The buyer? A wealthy developer named Markham Sterling, who planned to demolish their sanctuary and erect a monument to modern greed. The Pinnacle, a tower of luxury condos with river views and a rooftop infinity pool. Sully read it over Art's shoulder, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "They can't do this," he growled, the words a low rumble. Deacon put a hand on his arm. "Easy, Sully. There are rules. There are laws. Art will handle it." Art folded the letter with military precision, his knuckles white. He looked at the faces of his men, and then at the photos on the wall. He was a man who believed in the system he had fought to defend. He believed in order, in process, in the fundamental fairness of America. And in that moment, he believed that a simple conversation, a clear explanation of what this place meant, would be enough to make them understand. He was a master sergeant. He would approach the chain of command. He would make his case. He would fix this. He had no idea he had just received the opening salvo in a war he never saw coming. The foundations of our lives can feel like solid rock until the day we discover they are built on sand. For the men of Post 789, the ground had just begun to shift beneath their feet. If their story resonates with you, consider hitting that like button to show your support. We have a long road ahead, and every voice of encouragement matters. Now, let's see what happens when good men try to reason with relentless progress. A battle is not always fought with bullets and bayonets. Sometimes, the most brutal sieges are waged with paperwork, with condescending smiles and the crushing weight of a system designed to outlast the will of an ordinary person. For Master Sergeant Art Corrigan, the fight for VFW Post 789 would not be in the jungles he knew, but in the sterile, air-conditioned corridors of power. True to his nature, Art began by the book. He requested a meeting with the city council. He spent a week preparing, gathering documents, the Post's original charter from 1946, its designation as a local historic site, a designation they now claimed was non-binding, and testimonials from community groups they had supported for decades. He put on his best suit, the one he saved for funerals and weddings, and walked into City Hall with Deacon at his side, his back straight, his resolve firm. They were kept waiting for 45 minutes before being shown into the office of Councilwoman Davis. She was a woman who radiated an aura of polished, professional indifference. She offered them a brief, tight-lipped smile and gestured to two chairs that seemed intentionally less comfortable than her own. "Master Sergeant," she began, already glancing at the clock on her wall. "I have your letter. I understand your sentimental attachment to the property. We all appreciate your service, of course." The phrase, "of course," hung in the air like an insult. Art laid out his case, not with anger, but with the quiet dignity of a man stating undeniable facts. He spoke of the generations of veterans who found refuge there. He spoke of the community outreach, the toy drives at Christmas, the scholarships they funded. He spoke of the Post as a living memorial. "This isn't just a building, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "It is a promise made to the men and women who served, that they would have a place to call their own, that they would not be forgotten." Councilwoman Davis listened with the feigned patience of someone waiting for a child to finish a long-winded story. When he was done, she folded her hands. "Mr. Corrigan, the city's progress cannot be held hostage by nostalgia. Markham Sterling's development represents an immense increase in our tax base. It means jobs. It means revitalization. It's the future." "And what about our past?" Deacon asked softly, speaking for the first time. "Doesn't that count for anything?" The councilwoman gave him a patronizing look. "We have, of course, arranged a replacement for you. A very suitable one." She slid a brochure across the desk. It showed a rendering of a sterile, windowless room in the basement of a new community center. The room was labeled Seniors Jar Veterans Activities Room. It was tiny, soulless, and squeezed between a yoga studio and a childcare facility. Art looked at the glossy paper, then back at her. The insult was so profound, it left him breathless. They weren't just taking their home. They were erasing their identity, lumping them in as just another seniors group in need of a place to play bingo. He saw the truth in her eyes. She didn't see heroes. She saw an inconvenience. The meeting was over. They walked out of City Hall, not with a sense of hope, but with the cold, hard realization that they were not partners in a discussion. They were an obstacle to be managed. The next phase was the legal battle. A young, idealistic lawyer from the neighborhood, whose grandfather had been a member of the Post, offered to take their case pro bono. They held fundraisers. The men dug into their own meager savings. They were hopeful. They were fighters. But they were bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight. Markham Sterling's development firm wheeled out a team of corporate lawyers who looked like they'd been assembled in a lab for the sole purpose of crushing spirits. They drowned the court in motions, depositions, and procedural delays. They argued that eminent domain for economic redevelopment was a well-established legal precedent. They painted the veterans as a small special interest group standing in the way of prosperity for the entire city. The days in court were grueling. Art, Sully, Deacon, and Junior sat on the hard wooden benches, listening to lawyers who charged more per hour than they received in a month from Social Security dissect and devalue their history. The Post was called dilapidated, a financial drain, a relic of a bygone era. With every word, another piece of their pride was chipped away. The judge, a man who seemed more annoyed by the proceedings than interested in justice, finally made his ruling. He spoke in a monotone, citing case law and precedent. The city, he declared, was well within its rights. The loophole was ironclad. The seizure was legal. The sound of the gavel falling echoed in the silent courtroom like a gunshot. It was the sound of defeat, the sound of their world breaking. They had played by the rules. They had trusted the system. And the system had told them, in no uncertain terms, that their sanctuary, their history, and their honor had a price tag, and they couldn't afford it. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, blinking. The world seemed to be moving on, laughing, talking, living, completely unaware that a promise had just been officially, legally, and irrevocably broken. Sully slammed his fist into his other hand, a look of pure rage on his face. Deacon stared at the pavement, his spirit visibly diminished. Art just stood there, the weight of the loss pressing down on him. He had led his men into a battle and had been thoroughly, completely routed. The siege of paper and pride was over, and they had lost. How does a good person react when the rules they've lived by fail them? When the system they swore to protect turns its back? For the men of Post 789, this was no longer a legal dispute. It had become a question of their very soul. Their next move would determine whether they would fade away quietly or find a different way to fight. Defeat has a taste. It's bitter and metallic like old blood. In the days following the court's decision, that taste filled the air at VFW Post 789. The usual boisterous arguments fell silent. The coffee seemed weaker, the chairs less comfortable. The men sat in small, quiet groups, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the room. What now? They were adrift, their anchor cut loose by a judge's gavel. It was in this moment of near despair that the Post began to fight back, not with anger, but with memory. It was Deacon who started it. He was polishing glasses behind the bar, his movements slow and deliberate. A younger member, a veteran of the war in Afghanistan who had just joined, was sitting there, looking utterly lost. "I don't get it, Deacon," the young man said. "It's just a building. Why don't we just take their stupid room in the community center?" Deacon stopped polishing. He looked not at the young man, but at a faded spot on the bar, worn smooth by countless elbows over half a century. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice soft but clear. "When I came home from Korea in '53, people didn't know what to do with us. The big one was over, and we were from the forgotten war. I felt invisible, like a ghost. I ended up in this town, didn't know a soul. One night, I was walking by this very building. I was lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. The commander at the time, a man named Old Bill Swenson, a veteran of Normandy, saw me through the window. He came out, put his arm on my shoulder and said, 'You look like you could use a cup of coffee, son.' He sat me down right here, on this stool. He didn't ask me what I'd seen. He just listened. That man, in this room, saved my life that night. So no, son, it's not just a building." The story hung in the air, thick with meaning. A few moments later, Sully, who had been listening from a corner table, chimed in. His voice, usually a roar, was thick with emotion. "He's right," Sully said, walking over to the wall of photos from Vietnam. He pointed to a picture of a raucous party. "You see this? That was our welcome home party. Spring of '72. We didn't get parades. We got spit on at the airport. We got called names I won't repeat in here. But the older guys, the WFW and Korea vets, they knew. They threw us this party. They bought the beer. They slapped us on the back, and they told us, 'Welcome home, brother.' In this hall, right here. For one night, we weren't baby killers. We were soldiers. We were home. You can't get that in a basement next to a yoga class." Now the stories began to flow. A river of memories washing away the bitterness of defeat, replacing it with a deep, resonant purpose. Men talked about wedding receptions, christenings, and somber memorials for fallen friends, all held within these walls. Then Art spoke, his voice quiet. He pointed to the small, slightly raised stage in the corner. "My Helen," he began, and the room went silent. She organized a fundraiser for the children's hospital on that stage. She wasn't a veteran, but she said this post belonged to the whole community. She spent weeks planning it. She got the whole town involved. The night of the event, she was so happy. Her face was just radiant. We danced on that floor after everyone had gone home. It was the last time we ever danced. He looked around the room, at the worn floorboards, at the dusty stage. This building holds the last dance I ever had with my wife. Tell me, how do you put a price on that? The room was filled with the ghosts of laughter, tears, and brotherhood. They weren't just fighting for a building anymore. They were fighting for the last dance. They were fighting for the first welcome home. They were fighting for the cup of coffee that saved a life. It was into this sacred atmosphere that the final insult arrived. A uniformed sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable, walked in and handed an official document to Art. It was the final notice of eviction. They had 72 hours to vacate the premises before their property would be seized. The paper felt like a death sentence. The memories, the valor, the history, it all meant nothing. The deadline was real. The bulldozers were coming. That's when Sully exploded. "No," he roared, slamming his hand on the bar. "I am not leaving. I didn't retreat in the Ashau Valley, and I'm not retreating now. They want this building. They'll have to drag my old carcass out of it." "Sully, be sensible," Deacon cautioned. "You'll get arrested." "It's a better death than fading away in some government basement," Sully shot back. Then Junior, the quiet, tech-savvy vet, looked up from his phone. "He might be onto something," he said. "Not the violence part, but the standoff part. If we barricade ourselves in, if we make them physically evict us, I can get this online. I can call the local news. The image, a bunch of decorated veterans in their 70s and 80s being dragged out of their own VFW Post to make way for luxury condos. Markham Sterling can't survive that." A new kind of energy filled the room. It was not the energy of despair, but the electric hum of defiance. All eyes turned to Art. He was their commander. The decision was his. He looked at the eviction notice in his hand, a piece of paper that represented the failure of the system he'd trusted. Then he looked at the faces of his men, filled with a new, desperate fire. He looked at the stage where he'd danced with Helen. He had followed the rules. He had lost. Now, there was only one rule left. You don't abandon your post. He folded the eviction notice and tucked it into his pocket. He stood up straight, and the master sergeant returned. "All right," Art said, his voice ringing with an authority they hadn't heard in years. "Tonight, we secure the perimeter. We're not leaving. This is the last garrison. There comes a time when all other options are exhausted, when reason has failed, and justice is blind. At that moment, a choice must be made, to surrender or to stand. The men of Post 789 have made their choice. Their story is a powerful reminder that some things are worth fighting for. If you believe that too, I invite you to share your own thoughts in the comments below. What does honor mean to you in the modern world? We'll be right back for the final stand. The night is often a time for ghosts, for regrets, and for the quiet surrender to the coming day. But on this night, inside VFW Post 789, the air was not filled with surrender. It was electric with purpose. This was not a night of endings. It was the night of the last stand. An operation was underway, led by men whose bodies were old, but whose spirits were forged in the timeless discipline of the American military. Master Sergeant Art Corrigan was in command. There was no question. He moved through the hall, not as a weary retiree, but as the NCO he had always been, issuing orders with quiet, efficient authority. "Sully, you and your boys take the main entrance. That pool table, get it on its side. It'll make a solid barricade. Deacon, you're on inventory, first aid, coffee, and whatever food we have in the kitchen. Junior, you're our communications. Get your phone charged. You're our window to the world." The men moved with a surprising energy. Backs creaked, knees groaned, but the muscle memory was there. They were a platoon again. The heavy oak bar was unbolted and pushed against the back door. Filing cabinets filled with decades of records were dragged to block the windows. The sounds were of old men straining, punctuated by grunts and the occasional curse. But woven through it was the sound of teamwork, a symphony of defiance. They weren't just piling up junk. They were fortifying a position. They were digging in. The most powerful moment came just before midnight. Art went to the old locker in his office and pulled out a garment bag. Then another and another. He walked into the main hall and handed them out. Inside each bag was an old uniform, army greens, marine dress blues. Faded, a little tight in the middle but still bearing the stripes, the ribbons and the medals each man had earned with his blood and his youth. One by one, they changed. As they buttoned the jackets and straightened the ties, a transformation occurred. The stooped shoulders of old men straightened into the proud posture of soldiers. The weary eyes now held a steely glint of resolve. They were no longer just Art, Sully, and Deacon. They were Master Sergeant Corrigan, Gunnery Sergeant O'Connell, and Specialist Jones. They were the living embodiment of the legacy they were fighting to protect. They were the last garrison, reporting for duty. Dawn broke cold and gray. The first to arrive was not the police, but a tow truck and a small crew of bewildered-looking men in hard hats. The eviction team. They stopped 50 feet from the entrance, staring at the barricaded door, at the American flag flying proudly from its pole, and at the faces of old soldiers staring back at them from the windows. The foreman made a call. Within 20 minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up, sirens off. The young sheriff who had served the notice got out, his face a mask of weary resignation. He approached the door with a megaphone. "Art, it's Sheriff Miller. We know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it has to be." It was then that Junior put their plan into motion. He had already sent an email to the tip line of every local news station. Now he started a live stream from his phone, propping it up in the window. He spoke in a low, clear voice. "This is Junior Miller, from inside VFW Post 789. We are decorated veterans of the United States Armed Forces, and we are being evicted from our home to make way for a luxury condo development. We are not leaving." The effect was instantaneous. First, a single news van from a local affiliate arrived, then another. Within an hour, the street was a chaotic circus of satellite trucks, reporters, and curious onlookers. The story was irresistible. The visuals were a public relations nuke. Markham Sterling was likely eating a croissant and reading the Wall Street Journal when his phone started ringing, and ringing, and ringing. He turned on the news to see the lead story. Images of men in their 70s and 80s, their chests adorned with purple hearts and bronze stars, barricaded inside a historic building, refusing to be thrown out for his glittering condo tower. Reporters shoved microphones toward the mail slot in the front door. Art, as their commander, was the one who spoke. A young, ambitious reporter asked him why they were willing to be arrested. Art leaned down, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the hushed street and into thousands of homes via live television. "This building isn't just wood and brick," he said, his words cutting through the noise. "It's a covenant, a promise made by a grateful nation that we would not be forgotten. We are here today to respectfully and peacefully insist that America keep its promise." The phrase was dynamite. The unbroken promise. It became the headline. The story went from local to national in a matter of hours. The live stream Junior was running had tens of thousands of viewers. The comment section was a tidal wave of outrage directed squarely at the city council and at Markham Sterling. Veterans groups from across the country began issuing statements of support. A local union leader showed up with coffee and donuts for the news crews and loudly declared his members would never cross a picket line of American heroes. Inside the Post, the men watched the drama unfold on a small television. They were exhausted, but exhilarated. They had drawn a line in the sand, and the world was starting to notice. The siege was no longer one of paper and pride. It was a siege of conscience. And the men of the last garrison, in their faded uniforms, behind their makeshift barricades, were, improbably, winning. Pressure can burst pipes, or it can create diamonds. For Markham Sterling, the pressure building outside VFW Post 789 was threatening to shatter his multi-million-dollar project into a million pieces of bad press. His brand wasn't about luxury and river views anymore. It was about evicting war heroes. His investors were calling. The mayor was calling. The polished, unshakable facade of the modern developer was cracking under the weight of an old-fashioned concept: honor. The standoff lasted for 36 hours. 36 hours of news cycles, viral videos, and a relentless, growing wave of public support for the men inside the Post. Finally, Sterling knew he was beaten. Not by lawyers, not by politicians, but by a handful of stubborn old men and the power of their story. Markham Sterling didn't change his mind in a moment of enlightenment. He changed it in a moment of fear. His phone had not stopped ringing for 36 hours, not with calls, but with consequences. Investors were spooked. Board members were furious. Protesters had begun appearing at Sterling Properties headquarters, holding up enlarged photos of the veterans in uniform behind barricades. Cornered, he called a press conference. His designer suit looked slightly wrinkled, his voice flatter than usual. He read from a prepared statement with carefully chosen humility. In light of the overwhelming response from the community, he said, and after extensive dialogue with our partners and civic leaders, Sterling Properties will no longer pursue redevelopment of the VFW Post 789 site. There was polite applause, but then he continued, with a hint of corporate calculation masked as generosity. As a gesture of good faith, and in recognition of the Post's place in this city's legacy, we will fund a full restoration of the building, at no cost to the veterans or taxpayers. Inside the Post, the men watched it unfold on their tiny television. No cheers, just a quiet, collective breath released. The war was over. 3 months later, VFW Post 789 stood renewed. Its bricks gleamed under fresh mortar, but its soul was intact. The bar was rebuilt, the photos rehung with reverence, and the air smelled not of new paint, but of memory returning home. On opening day, Art Corrigan stood behind the new bar, tying his apron with practiced hands. He looked older now, but not weaker. The room buzzed with life, old voices, young laughter, boots and heels of every generation stepping across a restored floor that had once been nearly erased. A young Marine captain, home from her second tour, approached him. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," she said. "You reminded everyone what this place means." Art smiled faintly, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out an old challenge coin, worn, dull-edged, but still bearing the insignia of the Post, and placed it in her palm. "Then you know what to do, Captain," he said. "Hold the line, like we did." She closed her hand around the coin, her grip firm. And just like that, the Post was passed. And so, the story of the last garrison comes to a close. But it leaves us with a lesson that echoes far beyond the walls of one VFW Post. It teaches us that our history is not a liability to be paved over for a new condo. It is the bedrock on which our future is built. It reminds us that a promise made to those who serve is a sacred covenant, not a line item on a budget that can be conveniently erased. The men of Post 789 were not fighting against progress. They were fighting for the soul of progress. They proved that honor, integrity, and courage are not old-fashioned ideals. They are timeless, powerful forces. They showed the world that you are never too old to make a stand, and that a small group of determined hearts can remind a nation of its conscience. They fought not with weapons of war, but with the unyielding power of their own story, and in doing so, they won a victory for every single one of us who believes that some things are not for sale. Their promise was unbroken, and their legacy is a challenge to us all, to identify the sanctuaries in our own communities, the places of memory and meaning, and to have the courage to defend them, to hold our post. Thank you for joining us on this journey. The story of the last garrison is a testament to the American spirit. We would be honored to hear what it meant to you. Please leave a comment below, like this video if it moved you, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Until next time, stand for what you believe in.